The year was 2004, in the heart of the northern mountains of Vietnam. It was a bitterly cold winter morning, the kind of cold that cuts through to your very bones. A heavy white blanket of snow covered every branch, every path, and every inch of the tiny village. The scene was otherworldly, as if frozen in time. Thick mist swirled around, cloaking the already sleepy hamlet in a shroud of mystery. Houses with earthen walls huddled at the base of the hills, their roofs capped with layers of frost. The faint trails of smoke escaping narrow chimneys were the only signs of life in this vast, desolate stillness. Even the birds seemed to have abandoned their usual songs, their chirps reduced to sparse, fleeting echoes, which quickly faded back into silence. It was as if the winter had muted everything, demanding reverence for its icy grip. Beneath an old, weathered bridge that stretched over a frozen stream, 5 small children huddled together. They were wrapped in tattered, thin clothing, garments that had long lost their battle against time and wear. The eldest, a thin girl of about 11 years, sat with her back against the bridge's cold stone pillar. Her frail arms encircled her younger siblings, pulling them close in a protective embrace. Her dark, watchful eyes darted around, filled with both caution and determination. She looked like a sparrow guarding her nest from a looming predator, fragile but fiercely protective. Her name was Oanan. She was the eldest of 5 siblings who had been left orphaned and alone in this freezing winter. Beside her sat Thao, a girl of 9. Thao hugged her knees tightly, her tear-streaked face buried against Owan's side. Silent and withdrawn, she clung to her sister for warmth, her large, glassy eyes red and swollen from crying. Then there was Mo, just 3 years old. Mo whimpered softly, her small voice trembling as she murmured the word "mama" over and over again, her breath forming fragile clouds in the frigid air. Her little body quaked, the cold and hunger leaving her face pale and her lips a faint blue. She was the most sensitive of the 5, always quick to cry whenever she was scared, hungry, or cold. Next was Nai, 5 years old, who sat silently with her head resting against Owan's shoulder. Nai didn't even have the strength to cry anymore. Her legs, thin and trembling, clung tightly to Owan's. Her dirt-smeared face bore streaks of dried tears, the residue of emotion she no longer had the energy to express. And then, cradled in Owan's lap, was Bong, the youngest, just 2 years old. Bong was feverish, her small body racked with heavy, rattling breaths. Her thin, ragged blanket had done little to shield her from the bitter cold, and her tiny frame shuddered with each harsh cough. Owan had wrapped her in the only piece of fabric they had left, trying desperately to keep her warm, even as her own fingers turned numb and raw. The 5 children had no idea why they had been abandoned. Earlier that morning, as the first light of dawn filtered through the cracks of their run-down straw hut, they had awoken to find their parents gone. The house was eerily quiet, the thin walls no longer echoing their parents' voices. Frightened and bewildered, they had scoured the entire village, asking everyone if they had seen their parents, but to no avail. Eventually, Owan had led her siblings to the old bridge, a secluded spot where they might find some shelter from the relentless mountain wind. Yet now, as the freezing air gnawed at their thin clothing and bare feet, it felt as if even the bridge had turned against them. The cold had no mercy. Suddenly, the creak of bicycle wheels broke through the stillness. The sound was faint at first, a rhythmic clatter that gradually grew louder as it approached. A figure emerged at the far end of the bridge, a man riding an old, rusted bicycle. His tattered jacket flapped against the wind, and from the handlebars hung bags filled with potatoes and a bundle of firewood. This was Mr. Vin, a man in his 50s, a former soldier. He lived alone at the edge of the village. Life had not been kind to him. The war had taken everything, his family, his home, and his peace. Since then, He had retreated into solitude, spending his days in quiet isolation, far removed from the world's chaos. As Mr. Vin pedaled closer to the middle of the bridge, he suddenly stopped. His sharp eyes caught sight of a strange and heart-wrenching scene. 5 children huddled together beneath the bridge, their fragile bodies trembling against the unforgiving cold. His heart clenched. Stepping off his bicycle, he approached cautiously, his weathered hands gripping the handlebars tightly. His voice, hoarse from years of silence, broke the icy air. "Who are you?" he asked, his tone equal parts curiosity and concern. Owan stiffened. Her head snapped up, her eyes locking onto the stranger. She tightened her grip on her siblings, her body tense like a cornered animal. Owan hesitated, her instincts screaming not to trust anyone. But something in Mr. Vin's voice, something steady and resolute, made her pause. She looked down at her siblings, at Thau's tear-streaked face, at Mo's shivering body, at Ni's vacant stare, and finally at little Bong, who now barely stirred in her arms. Slowly she nodded. For the first time that day, a glimmer of hope broke through the icy haze. The old man leaned down gently, placing his hand on Bong's burning forehead. "She's burning up with fever," he muttered, his voice tinged with worry. He looked at the 5 children huddled together. "Come with me to my house. I'll help you," he said softly. Shan, the eldest, immediately shook her head vehemently, tears streaming down her cheeks. "No, we won't go. If you take us to the shelter, we'll be separated. I'd rather die than let that happen." Her words erupted like a desperate cry, piercing through the cold, bleak morning. The old man, Mr. Vin, froze. He looked at Owan, then at the 4 other children clinging tightly to each other, their small hands clasped in fear. Their innocent eyes mirrored terror, pain, and a silent plea for help. His heart ached. "I promise," he said after a long pause, his voice trembling but firm. "I won't let anyone separate you. Let's go now. Bong can't endure this any longer." Owan hesitated, her tear-filled eyes searching his face for the truth. After what felt like an eternity, she gave a slight nod. Mr. Vin took off his padded jacket, gently wrapped it around Bong, and lifted the frail girl into his arms. "Come, my house is nearby," he said. The children followed silently, their bare, tiny feet pressed against the icy, frost-covered ground, leaving behind faint, trembling footprints. Yet in their steps was a glimmer of hope. Mr. Vin's house was nestled at the foot of a hill, small and unassuming. Its thatched roof was weathered, and the earthen walls had long faded, but it was a refuge from the bitter cold outside. Inside, the house exuded a faint warmth, a sharp contrast to the freezing world beyond its walls. He quickly lit a fire in the hearth. The soft crackling of wood sent a wave of warmth through the dim room, chasing away the shadows. Owan sat close to the fire, cradling Bong in her arms. Slowly, the little girl stirred. Her small, cracked lips moved faintly as she murmured, "Sister," before falling back into a feverish slumber. Mr. Vin prepared a small pot of thin porridge using the sparse remnants of rice he had. He carefully fed spoonfuls to Bong, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he worked. A deep sigh escaped his lips as he watched the little one drift back into a fragile sleep, her tiny body nestled in his arms. That night, all 5 children crowded together on the single bamboo bed in the house, their thin, shivering frames pressed close for warmth. Mr. Vin sat by the fire, his old eyes gazing into the flickering flames. Sadness hung heavy in his expression, but there was also a faint glimmer of resolve. He whispered to himself, "From now on, I will be their family." Outside, snow continued to fall relentlessly, blanketing the world in white. But inside the little house, a fire had been lit, not just in the hearth, but in the heart of the old man and the children. It was a fire of love, hope, and the beginning of a new journey. The faint winter sun barely managed to cast its light through the thick, heavy clouds, quickly retreating behind the gray sky. The air outside was cuttingly cold, biting into the skin like shards of glass. But inside the small house, the warm crackling of the fire filled the silence. The mingling scent of wood smoke and the damp thatch roof created an odd sense of comfort. Mr. Vin sat near the hearth, his eyes drifting to the bamboo bed where the 5 children were huddled like a flock of baby birds after a storm. The thin blanket covering them wasn't enough to keep out the biting cold, so Owan, the eldest, lay on the edge, holding Bong tightly against her chest to keep her warm. That night, Mr. Vin didn't sleep. He sat silently by the fire, deep in thought. His mind raced with worry. How long can I care for them? How will I provide for them? The questions looped endlessly in his head. But then he remembered Owan's tear-filled eyes earlier that day, the way she had looked at him and called him father. That memory stirred something deep within him, silencing his doubts. He resolved firmly, I'll do whatever it takes. The war had once taken everything from him, his family, his home, his hope. Now, at the twilight of his life, fate had entrusted him with these 5 fragile lives. He didn't believe it was by chance. The next morning, Mr. Vin rose before dawn. The faint crowing of roosters echoed from distant farms, and a thin mist clung to the thatched roof of his small house. The chill of the frost stung his skin as he started a fire to prepare breakfast. Using the last bits of rice from his meager stores, he cooked another pot of watery porridge. It was all he had left, but he didn't hesitate. As the fire filled the little house with warmth once more, the children began to stir. Bong was the last to wake, her wide, confused eyes glancing around the room. "Sister, where are we?" she asked in a weak, trembling voice. Owen leaned down and hugged her tightly. "It's okay, Bong. We're home now. This is our home with Father Vin," she whispered soothingly. Mr. Vin placed the pot of porridge on the table and called them to eat. Owan carefully ladled out portions for each of her siblings, taking the smallest portion for herself. Mr. Vin watched her silently. Her small, delicate hands moved cautiously, as though spilling even a single drop of porridge would be an unforgivable waste. His heart ached as he watched her. An 11-year-old child shouldn't bear such burdens. She should be playing, laughing, and being cared for by her parents. Instead, she had become the pillar of strength for her younger siblings. In her, he saw a reflection of himself as a young man, once burdened by too much, too soon. The days that followed were difficult. The small house at the foot of the hill became a bustling home, filled with laughter, tears, and the relentless struggle of survival. The single-room dwelling had little space for the 6 of them, but they made it work. Owan, despite her age, quickly took on responsibilities. She helped Mr. Vin with household chores, cooked simple meals, and comforted her siblings when they cried. The younger children, though frail and often sick, began to adapt to their new life. The house lacked many things: food, clothing, and comfort, but it was filled with something far more precious: love. It wasn't just a shelter from the cold, it was a sanctuary for their hearts, a place where they could begin to heal. Though the journey ahead was uncertain, one thing was clear: a family had been born in that small house. And no matter how harsh the winter or how great the challenges, the fire of love and hope burned brighter with each passing day. Mr. Vin made a humble choice. He gave up his bed for the children, laying out an old, torn mat on the cold floor near the kitchen for himself. By day, he busied himself with grueling tasks, chopping firewood, patching the leaking roof, and working as a hired hand for families in the village. His hard-earned coins were carefully saved to buy rice, ensuring the children wouldn't go hungry. At night, his hands found no rest. He sat near the dim light of the fire, mending clothes and repairing worn-out sandals. Every stitch, every patch was filled with care, so the children would have something to wear when they stepped outside. Even Owan, though still young, had learned to share his burden. Each morning she woke up early to sweep the house, wash and wring the laundry, and keep an eye on her younger siblings. Once Mr. Vin spotted Owen standing behind the house. She held tightly to Bong's torn little shirt, still hanging on the clothesline. Her small frame shivered in the cold. Her lips trembled, but her eyes burned with determination. Placing a gentle hand on her shoulder, he softly said, "Owen, come inside. It's too cold out here." She turned to face him, her eyes red and swollen, her voice breaking as she whispered, "Dad, I don't want Bong to be cold." For a long moment, Mr. Vin gazed at her. His throat tightened and his eyes brimmed with unshed tears. Finally, he gave a slight nod, his heart heavy yet full of pride. Inside the house, Thao and Mo stayed close to each other. Thao was the quietest of the children, often sitting in a corner, absent-mindedly drawing circles in the dirt, as if trying to distract herself from some unspoken fear. Mo, in contrast, was more fragile. She cried often and clung to Owen wherever she went. Owen, despite her own exhaustion, comforted her little sister with words of reassurance. "Mo, don't cry. I'm here. We'll be okay." I promise. Only then would Mo's sobbing subside, her small hands clutching Owen's shirt like a lifeline. Meanwhile, little Nee and Bong always ran to Mr. Vin whenever he returned home, their tiny voices calling out, "Daddy, Daddy!" One evening, after a long day of toiling in the fields, Mr. Vin arrived home, utterly exhausted. As he approached the house, Bong's small, hoarse voice rang out, "Daddy's back!" At that moment, every ache and pain in his body seemed to melt away. The simple, innocent sound of being called Daddy was more precious to him than anything else in the world. But their struggles did not go unnoticed by the villagers. Whispers began to spread, growing louder with each passing day. "He's so poor. He can barely feed himself. How can he possibly take care of all those children?" One neighbor scoffed. "Mark my words, he'll abandon them soon enough. He's just trying to look good in front of everyone," another sneered. These words were like invisible daggers, cutting deep into Mr. Vin's heart. Yet he remained silent. He did not argue, nor did he explain. Instead, he worked harder, his determination growing with every insult. He knew the children needed him, and that was all that mattered. One chilly evening, as he sat by the fire sewing a torn shirt for Owen, the sound of muffled sobs caught his attention. Stepping outside, he found Thao sitting under a tree, her small body trembling as she cried. He knelt beside her, his voice low and gentle. "Why are you out here all alone, sweetheart?" Thao wiped her tears with the back of her hand, her voice shaking as she said, "They said you won't be able to take care of us. That you'll leave us and will be abandoned again." The pain in her words struck him like a blow. For a moment he was silent, his chest tight with emotion. Then, placing a comforting hand on her head, he spoke with quiet conviction. "Thao, listen to me. I will never leave you. No matter what happens, we'll face it together, as a family." That night, long after the children had fallen asleep, Mr. Vin sat by the fire. He stared into the flickering flames, their light dancing in his tired eyes. In the warmth of the fire, he found a fragile yet unwavering hope, a small spark of faith that kept him moving forward. The days continued, each one filled with struggle, but also with love. To earn extra money, Mr. Vin took on grueling work as a construction laborer at a nearby site. His once strong hands, which had once carried weapons to defend the country, were now rough and calloused from carrying bricks and mixing cement. One day, he fell from the scaffolding, hitting the ground hard. His body ached unbearably, but by evening, he was back on his feet, limping home with a small bag of rice in his hand. As soon as the children saw him, they rushed to greet him. Owen's eyes filled with worry as she noticed his limp. "Dad, are you hurt? Does it hurt a lot?" He smiled, brushing off her concern with a wave of his hand. "No, sweetheart, Dad's fine. Look, we have rice now. Tonight we'll have a proper meal." Their dinners were simple, often just plain rice with a few salted vegetables. But around the worn wooden table, laughter and warmth filled the air. Even with so little, they cherished each other deeply. Sometimes Owan would give up her portion, gently pushing it toward Bong. "I'm full, Dad. You eat, Bong." Mr. Vin knew she wasn't telling the truth, but he didn't say anything. He simply looked at her with quiet admiration, his resolve hardening even further. "I will do better," he thought to himself. "I won't let them go hungry or cold forever. I can't fail them." Life was harsh, but it was also filled with moments of tender sacrifice and unbreakable love. As the spring season arrived, peach blossoms bloomed across the mountains and forests, brightening the once cold and desolate landscape. Mr. Vin and the children worked together to rebuild the old wooden fence in front of their house and repair the leaky thatched roof in preparation for the upcoming Lunar New Year. On the afternoon of New Year's Eve, Mr. Vin returned home carrying a small peach branch he had received from a neighbor. He placed the branch in the center of their modest home and said warmly to the children, "This year, we have peach blossoms for Tet." Owan, the eldest girl, hugged him tightly, her eyes filled with tears. "Thank you, Dad. This new year, we're not afraid anymore," she whispered, her voice trembling with gratitude. That evening, as the clock struck midnight, the family gathered around the warm glow of a fire. They shared pieces of banh chung, a traditional Tet rice cake, which Mr. Vin had been given by a kind neighbor. Laughter echoed through the small home, pushing back the biting cold of winter. Mr. Vin gazed at the 5 children. His heart swelled with a happiness he hadn't felt in years. He softly said, "From now on, you won't be alone anymore. I promise." Outside, petals from the peach blossoms danced in the wind, and in the little house nestled at the foot of the hill, a family was being built, one founded on love and resilience. Though their journey had only just begun, both Mr. Vin and the children had found something invaluable, a true home. Life continued quietly in their small house. The rare peace they enjoyed slowly became a comforting routine. Mr. Vin had grown accustomed to waking up early each morning to prepare a simple breakfast before cycling to the village to find work. In the evenings, when he returned home to the sound of the children's cheerful voices running out to greet him, his heart would fill with warmth, a joy he could never have imagined. But that peace was not destined to last. One fateful morning, a heavy storm loomed on the horizon, with thick clouds gathering in the sky. Mr. Vin had just returned home from a night shift at a construction site when he saw a group of local officials waiting at the gate. He stopped his bicycle abruptly, gripping the handlebars tightly as his chest filled with unease. One of the officials, Mr. Fat, who oversaw social welfare in the area, stepped forward. His tone was firm but cold. "Mr. Vin," he began, "we've received a report stating that you are not capable of caring for these 5 children. We are obligated to take them to the Social Protection Center." The words hit Mr. Vin like a thunderbolt. His body froze, and he leaned his bicycle against a tree, his trembling hands betraying his struggle to contain his anger. "What did you just say?" he asked, his voice quivering. "I'm not capable? I've cared for them every single day. They're healthy, they're safe, they're happy. Isn't that enough?" Mr. Fat shook his head, his tone unwavering. "This isn't about love, Mr. Vin. It's about the law. You're a single man with no stable income, and you cannot legally prove that you can provide for their education. We have no other choice." Inside the house, Owan had overheard the confrontation. She rushed outside, placing herself between Mr. Fat and her siblings. Her tear-streaked face radiated determination. "We're not going anywhere. "This is our home and this is our family. Don't take us away," she cried. Behind her, Thao, Mo, Ni, and little Bong emerged, clinging tightly to one another. Bong grabbed the hem of Mr. Vin's shirt, her innocent face tilted up toward him, her voice trembling with fear. "Daddy, you won't let them take us away, will you?" Mr. Vin looked down at the 5 children, their eyes filled with desperation, the same eyes that had once gazed at him from under the bridge on that freezing winter's day, abandoned and hopeless. His heart clenched as he knelt down and embraced them. Lifting his head, he stared straight at Mr. Fat. "I won't let anyone tear this family apart," he said, his voice resolute. "Give me a chance. I'll do whatever it takes to prove that I can care for them." Mr. Fat sighed heavily. "You have the right to appeal," he said, "but for now the children must be taken to the center. It's the law." The official's words felt like a knife slicing through the air. Owan screamed, tears streaming down her face. "Dad, we're not leaving. Don't let them take us away." The cries of all 5 children filled the small yard, piercing the cold morning. Mr. Vin held them close, his own tears falling freely. "Don't be afraid," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I'll bring you home, I promise." But his promise felt hollow in the face of the unyielding system. When the vehicle from the Social Protection Center arrived and began driving away, Mr. Vin stood frozen, paralyzed by the heart-wrenching sight of the children reaching out for him, their voices echoing through the distance. "Daddy! Daddy!" The small house fell silent. Its once vibrant laughter was replaced by an unbearable emptiness. The fire in the hearth had long since gone out. Mr. Vin collapsed beside it, his head in his hands as an overwhelming void consumed him. It felt as if his world had been shattered once more, stripping him of the only family he had. But deep within him, the flame of love refused to die. Slowly he stood, his fists clenched. "I made a promise," he whispered to himself. "I will bring them back." In the days that followed, Mr. Vin embarked on a new battle, a battle not fought with fists, but with relentless determination and unwavering love. He was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, knowing that the children were his family, and families are worth fighting for. Every day he roamed the offices of the local government, submitting petitions to regain custody of the 5 children he called family. But everywhere he went, he was met with doubtful glances and cold rejections. They told him he was too poor, too old, too frail, an unfit guardian for such a heavy responsibility. Yet he refused to give up. To prove his worth, he worked tirelessly, taking on every odd job he could find. He saved every coin, every penny, determined to show that he could provide for his family. Each night, after long days of backbreaking labor, he would sit at his table. By the dim light of a flickering oil lamp, his trembling hands painstakingly wrote out appeals and letters, his hope etched into every shaky stroke of his pen. One day, the town council held a public meeting. The room was packed, buzzing with murmurs as people whispered about the unlikely man standing at the center of the hall, Mr. Vin. His frail figure trembled with emotion, but his eyes burned with resolve. In a voice steady, yet filled with raw vulnerability, he spoke. "I understand your doubts. I know what you're thinking, that I'm just a poor old man, unable to give these children the kind of life they deserve. But I have something no one else has: love and unwavering determination. These 5 children, they are my family. They are the reason I keep going every single day."